Hi, I'm Brad Hunt, President at Smooth Fusion. We're a web development company and a Sitefinity partner. And in this presentation today, I'm going to talk to you about how to integrate Sitefinity with other applications using webhooks and an automation tool called Zapier. As far as the agenda for today's presentation, we'll do a quick level set on webhooks. What are webhooks and why do we care? We'll take a look at what webhooks are available with the current versions of Sitefinity. And then we're going to look at several demos, and we'll start by creating an automation or an integration from scratch together, and that will give you the basic building blocks that you need to get started with your own automations. And then we'll look at a few automations that I've created ahead of time just to help you start brainstorming how you might use automations in your own business. As far as the audience for this presentation, it's not really a technical presentation. There are one or two code snippets that I'll copy and paste, and it's not really even important that you understand what they do entirely. I can provide them for you, and you can use them in any automation that you create. So really, anybody that can copy and paste some code and point and click in Sitefinity and inside Zapier can do these automations. And lastly, I'll be in the chat during the presentation. If you have a question, feel free to post that, and I'll do my very best to answer it. And if I don't have the answer for you immediately, I'll take your contact info and get back to you and hopefully point you in the right direction. So with that, let's get started and let's look at what are webhooks. Webhooks are automated messages sent from apps when something happens. And the message has a payload and it's sent to a unique or specific URL. In our case, the app that's generating the message is going to be Sitefinity. And when some event happens, a message will be sent, and that message contains JSON data, and it will be sent to some other unique URL. In our case, it's going to be a URL controlled by Zapier. So when we think about events that happen in Sitefinity, Sitefinity has a whole subsystem called the EventHub, and has had for a long time. So whenever a certain event happens inside of Sitefinity, the EventHub manages that event and raises that event. So for example, if somebody leaves a comment, if somebody changes a profile or publishes a page, the EventHub raises that event. And historically, as a developer, what you could do is write custom code to capture that event, to capture the event details, capture the data maybe of a form submission, and then send that data to some other API. But you'd have to do that manually. You'd have to write code to hook into the event and process the data manually. Well, that's the beauty of webhooks, is that they prevent you from having to write any custom code. So starting in Sitefinity 12.2, Sitefinity has support for 3 different webhooks out of the box. So it's when a form entry is created, when the output cache is invalidated, or whenever there's a login event on the site, a login's completed. And in each case, when these things happen, an event is fired, and you can tell Sitefinity to expose that event and to send data to a URL. And that's what we're going to do in our examples. So we're going to shift over to a website that I've set up ahead of time. This is a Sitefinity 13.1 site. If you've got at least Sitefinity 12.2 or higher, you can make use of the same webhooks that I'm using today. And I should say that in my examples, I'm mostly going to focus on the form entry created event, because that's what I'm using to capture form data and send it off to Zapier. So this, again, is a Sitefinity 13.1 site. I've created a few pages based on the resource package, a custom resource package that mimics our own Smooth Fusion website. And I've created some individual pages of content, and each of those individual pages of content basically has a form. So I've created ahead of time a number of different forms. So we'll start with a simple Contact Us example. And so on this website, I've got a contact page, and the contact page has a very simple contact form with first name, last name, email, and comments, and a submit button. So let's look at that form inside of the back end of Sitefinity. So it is the contact form. And I've not written any other custom code. All I've done is dragged and dropped a few elements onto this form to create the form that you saw on the front end. The one thing that's important to know when you're creating forms that are going to be used in an automation, at least in the way I'm doing it, is to make sure you go into each form element, go into the advanced properties, and set the field name. that field name is going to be used in Zapier, and so you want to make sure that form field name is set so that you can use it in the Zap that you're creating. So that's one thing that you might not normally do when you're creating a form. So if you don't do that, make sure you add the field name to all the forms that you have. So then we want to know, okay, we've got this form. It's going to generate some kind of event whenever it's completed. How do we tell Sitefinity to listen for that event and then take some action? So if you check out the webhook documentation and the Progress Sitefinity documentation, I just did a search for webhook in the documentation, and you'll see that you have the same 3 supported events that I mentioned. We've got the output cache invalidation event, we've got a login completed event, and a form entry created event. And if you scroll down on this page, you'll actually get some sample JSON for each of these events. So you can see what that payload or what that data looks like that's going to be sent over to the other system. And we'll come back and talk about that in just a little bit. So to register that event in Sitefinity, you need to copy and paste whichever event that you're working with. So for example, if I'm working with the iForm entry created event, I can copy this reference, go back to Sitefinity under Administration, Settings, and go to Advanced Settings, and then scroll all the way down till you get to Webhooks and Webhook Events. Now when you start, you won't have any webhook events. I've added examples for each of these different kinds of events. So if you, for example, didn't already have this iForm entry created event, you would click on Create New. You would paste in the code that you'd copied for whatever event you want to work with, and then it would show up on your list. Then once you have the event in there, you can start to specify the URLs. And so again, I've already got a number of things I've created ahead of time. And you can see that they all have URLs over to Zapier. So you have to know where to post the data. And so that comes from the destination or from the automation tool, in my case, Zapier. So if I'm going to start by creating a new automation for that contact form, then I want to go over to Zapier. And here's what the interface looks like. And they refer to these as a Zap. If you're in another system, they may be called Let Flow and Power Automate, for example. So I'm going to create a new Zap, and I'm going to use some of the out-of-the-box steps that Zapier provides. So one of the things that they have is a webhook step, and this is labeled as premium, and so the free edition of Zapier does not have this step. So you have to pay for at least their lower version, which I think is around $25 a month, to get these premium steps. So I'm going to start off with a webhook. And then I'm going to choose the trigger event. So what is the thing that's going to cause this Zap or this series of steps to fire? So you can either poll a URL, so you can tell it to go off and check a URL, or it can catch a hook. And that's what we want, because Sitefinity is going to trigger that webhook, and it's going to send data over to Zapier. And you have 2 choices here. You've got a hook or a raw hook. So let's start by just looking at what is the hook. So if I click Continue, the next thing it's going to tell me is the URL that I need to copy and paste into my system into Sitefinity so that Sitefinity knows where to send the data. So I'm going to copy this URL, go back to the settings and create a new URL, and I'm going to make sure that I'm underneath the form entry created because that's what I'm trying to capture. I'm going to paste that URL in there and hit Save Changes. So now if I go back to this contact form and I fill it out, and then I hit Submit, then what I should be able to do is go back to Zapier and click Continue. And when I do that, it's going to find the data that's been posted over to Zapier. So you can see I did a test, and it already recognized that that data came in. And so what Zapier does with this hook is it parses all the values that have come in from the JSON. So just as a reference, let's go back to the documentation. And I want to scroll down and look at this iForm entry created event. And you can see from this example, you get things like the user ID, the username, form name, and so on. And so those are the things that you see in Zapier: username, user ID, form ID, and so on. The problem with this approach is all of the individual fields in the form are just part of one variable or one property. They're called controls. And the reason for that is because that's what the JSON looks like that's sent from Sitefinity. So you have all the individual form fields, like in our case, first name, last name, email, and comments, and they're all under this controls variable or property. And so the problem then is in Zapier, if you want to use those values downstream in some other step, that's hard to do because it treats all of those controls as just one variable. And there are some things in Zapier you can do to parse that out, but I found a way that I think works better for my demonstrations. And so I'm going to change this from a hook to a raw hook. And if it's a raw hook, then what that means is you're getting just the raw JSON that's being parsed. And so I don't think this URL changed, so let's go ahead and click Continue. And we'll go back to the site, and we'll go back to the contact form and complete the contact form one more time. And submit it. And we can go back to Zapier and test that trigger again. And now we don't have those same properties. We just have one variable or one property called raw body. And so we get the raw JSON that matches what we saw from the documentation. So now that we've got that, we can continue to our next step. And as you saw, there's a number of different forms I already have on the website. And so we want to be able to distinguish when those events happen. We don't want every Zap to fire when any form event happens. And so what we want to do next is we want to add a filter. And there is a filter by Zapier. I'm going to use that. And then I'm going to select. So what you'll start to see is that when you do the subsequent steps, it's pulling in all the things it could find. And so I'm going to use this raw body because it's got the raw JSON from the post that came over. And I'm going to say only continue with this particular Zap if the raw body contains SF_contact. And I'm doing that because that is the name of the form that we created over in Sitefinity. So just real quick, if I go back to the contact form and I look at the form properties, should see that it has a name of SF_contact. And so this step is only going to continue if that data has that value. So what's nice is as you build the Zap, given that test data that's been submitted, you can step through this and see, and it's going to tell me, yes, this Zap would have continued because it did find that particular form data in the raw body of the JSON. So now, if this happened to be submitted from some other form in Sitefinity, this would not continue and this Zap would not proceed to the next step. So that's kind of how we filter and tie the different forms to the different Zaps that are created. So the next thing I want to do, I've got all of that JSON in just one raw body variable. And so I want to write some code to be able to parse those values so that I can use them elsewhere in the subsequent steps. The nice thing is that Zapier has a code step that we can add, and we can run JavaScript or Python right inside this step. And I'm going to choose JavaScript. And this is where what I alluded to earlier in the introduction, that there is a little bit of JavaScript that I'm going to use here. You don't necessarily have to understand it, but you could just copy and paste it. And so the input data that we're going to use, we're going to declare a variable called response. And then again, we're going to tell it to use the raw hook, raw body. So from the previous step, from step number 1, it's pulling in the raw body, and it's putting it in a variable called response. And so then I'm going to copy and paste some JavaScript that was written ahead of time. This is not something I wrote from scratch, but something I found. And so what it's doing is this variable response is here as part of the input data, and it's going to run some JavaScript that parses that JSON, finds the controls that are part of this control collection here that's referenced in the documentation, and then it's going to only keep from that the field control name and the value. So that's all I care about is the field control name and the field value. And then I am going to use a JavaScript function that reduces that, and it's basically converting the array to an object, and it's returning that so that we can use it inside of our Zap. So if that doesn't make sense to you, or if that's not entirely clear, this is just one way to parse that data and get into something that can be used downstream. So next I'll click Continue. And again, here's the input response. And if I test and review, then what I should see is now we've got this nice sort of structured data we can use where it says Sitefinity field name, field control name first, field control name last, and then it's got the value for each of those. So now I'll be able to use those in subsequent steps in my Zaps. So now I'm done editing this step. And for this example, the one I'm going to start with is adding a contact to HubSpot. We use HubSpot here at Smooth Fusion, and so I wanted to be able to add a contact to our HubSpot account. But I want to stop and say that if you can follow those 3 steps, you actually have everything you need to start building your own Zaps, whether you're integrating with HubSpot or some other system, because by this step you've captured the data, you've parsed the data, and you can submit that to some other system. So before I show you the HubSpot step, let's just go over and look at this is a HubSpot account I'm using. It's currently empty. I don't have any contacts listed here in the contacts list. And so what I'm going to do is add the HubSpot connector or application. And then there's a bunch of events that I can choose from HubSpot. And the very first one is create contact, and that's what I'm going to use. But you could also get contacts and create deals and create tickets, and just about everything you can do inside of HubSpot you can automate here. So I'm going to choose the create contact. And I have previously, before the presentation, already authenticated and connected my account. And you can see over here edit accounts. And so just like you're used to with any other systems that talk to each other, the first time you connect the systems you have to authenticate and put in a username and password, and behind the scenes it handles the API calls and stuff for you. And you can always change those accounts or revoke permissions or whatever you need to do. So in this case, I've already set up my HubSpot account, and I'll continue with that account that I selected from the dropdown. And now it's able to connect to that HubSpot account real time. And what it's done is this connector to HubSpot already has the ability to find all these different properties. And there's so many properties here, but I need to scroll down and try to find the one that would be like the first name, the last name, and the email for the contact. So here's first name. So now that I've run that JavaScript step above, here's kind of where the magic happens. You now show all of the different individual form fields that have been parsed out of that JSON. And you can look for the ones that end in value. So for example, this was the first name property that we're trying to write in HubSpot. So I'm going to grab the first name field. In my case, it was Brad from our example data. I'm going to scroll down and find the last name. So same thing, run JavaScript. I'm going to scroll down and find my last name here. And so now you can see Hunt will be in the last name, and I just need to find email. So run JavaScript, show options, and grab the email address. So now those 3 things are all I'm going to set for this example. But there's, as you can see, a whole number of other properties I could choose, and I'm going to click Continue. And when I test and review this step, it's actually going to call HubSpot and create that contact for me because I've been running that test sample all the way through. And you can see this was successful. It gave me the ID back of the contact that was created. And I should now be able to come over here into HubSpot and do a quick refresh. And I can see that my record was created. And it pulled in my properties, my first name, my last name, my email. And because HubSpot does some things behind the scenes, it looked up my domain and figured out I was associated with Smooth Fusion and pulled in some information there as well. I didn't have to do that manually. HubSpot just did that for me. So again, if you can follow this basic step, you can follow those same ideas to create your own integrations just by using different properties from the form controls. Because the nice thing about that JavaScript is no matter how many form controls you have in your form, or how different your form is from mine, that should pick up all those field values. Now, one thing I want to do is turn on this Zap, because right now I've just been running it in test mode. And I don't think I gave this one a name, so I'm going to go ahead and give this one a name called Create HubSpot Contact. You can, of course, name it whatever you like. And I'm going to turn it on. And so now it should be able to run on demand the next time somebody completes a form, a contact form. So I will go back over to the contact form and complete the contact form one more time. And this time I'll use Todd Knowlton. And submit his contact record. And if everything is wired up properly, I should be able to go back to HubSpot, go to contacts, and I should see Todd show up in just a minute. And if I'm worried that it's not working, what I can always do, and you can see there's Todd, what I can always do is go back to HubSpot and I can view the task history. And so I can find the task log and find what's run. So here's the Create HubSpot Contact, and I can click on that and I can see that it ran, that it found a web request, it processed the rule, or it passed the rule, it pulled the values out of that JSON data, Todd's first name and last name came out of the data, and then a new contact was created. So that's a cool feature of Zapier, is that you can look at the history and see that it's run. So again, with those basic steps, hopefully you can start to kind of dream up what are some things that you may do in your for your own business or for your own customers. So what I want to shift to next is I want to look at a number of automations that I've created ahead of time, and just again kind of maybe get your juices flowing for some ideas that you might do. So again, another example with HubSpot. I mentioned a minute ago that in addition to creating just a contact, you could also do something like create a deal. And so that's what this one is. So this form is a little different. So if I'm going to create a deal, I'm going to collect their first name, last name, email, company name, and what kind of website they're looking for. And so we use HubSpot Deals, and this is just a trial account I've got of HubSpot. So currently I don't have any deals listed, but if I wanted to programmatically create a deal, I can do that. So I've got a form, and this form is much like the contact form. It's just a form called Deal. It's got a name called SF_deal. And all of these are going to work in that same way. So if I go back to my deal form, and this time I'll use somebody else. I'll use Jake Picken. Sticking with Smooth Fusion people here. So in this case, I'm capturing the company name, and I'll capture what kind of website they're looking for. So we do a lot of Sitefinity work and a lot of just custom .NET application work. So I'll say that this is a Sitefinity website, and I'll click Submit. And just like before, if I come back over to Deals and I refresh, and now we've got the new deal, and it's in the lead category, and I can click on this deal, and it shows up in HubSpot, and it's associated with Jake Picken here on the right. So how did I do that? Let's look at this Zap that I had done ahead of time. I've got a folder here for Progress Accelerated at Next, and I'm going to look at the one that is Create a Deal in HubSpot. I've got the same steps that we used before, so I'm catching the raw hook. I'm only continuing if the field name has SF Deal in it. I'm going to run the same JavaScript that I ran before. And by the way, this still has some data from a previous run that I've done. If I wanted to debug this one again real time, what I could do is start over at the first step and do Find Data, and click here on this request and choose Load More. You can see that this request was pulled in 2 days ago. But if I click Load More, I can find the one that was just pulled in just a minute ago. And so you can always try to find the most recent request and run through it end to end if you're trying to debug something. So just like before, I created a contact in HubSpot, same exact step that I did before, and I mapped the fields for first name, last name, and email. So that's just like it was before. And then the new thing that I did in this app was I created a deal in HubSpot, and that works the same way. I can set the deal stage, I can choose the pipeline. So inside of HubSpot, you can have different deal stages that can be customized. And as it'll pull that deal stage in that matches your sales pipeline. So I've got the default sales pipeline. I've got the default stage that we would use when a lead comes in, for example. And in this case, for the deal name, I was just concatenating together the name of the company and then the type. So you could do that however you wanted that made sense for your environment. But that's just how I came up with the name of that deal. So the name of the company was Smooth Fusion and the type was Sitefinity. So the next step was a little bit interesting. I had to figure out how to do this because in HubSpot, you have to create associations between different entities. So for example, with this deal is associated with a contact or is associated with a company. And each of those objects exist independently. And so I had to run a step that was create an association between the deal and the contact. But to do that, I first had to get the IDs of each of those. So in the first step, I'm going to do a find contact, and then I'm going to find that contact based on the search property, that's the email, and then what comes out of that at the end, the property to retrieve is the contact ID. So in other words, I'm just using the built-in functionality for HubSpot to look up a person by their email address and get the ID of that person out. And then the same thing, I'm going to look up the deal. There's a find deal, and then I'm going to find the deal based on the name that I set in the previous step that I just explained with the name of the company and the type. And then finally, I create an association between the two. So this is a very flexible step. You can associate any different kinds of entities. So in this case, I was associating a contact with a deal, and then you put in the ID of the contact here and the ID of the deal, and it associates them together. So it takes a little bit of work once you get past the original figuring out how to capture the webhook from Sitefinity to start understanding the actual application you're going to integrate with, like in this case HubSpot, a little bit of experimentation to see how each different vendor created their connector and how to work with it. But that's how you create a deal associated with a contact in HubSpot. So moving right along, the next thing we're going to do is integrate with Zoom. So having people sign up for a webinar or an event is certainly a very popular thing to do these days, and everybody's on Zoom or other similar platforms. And so in this fictitious example, we've got a Halloween demo that we're doing for some reason on Halloween. And so over in Zoom, I've set up this meeting ahead of time. So I've got a Halloween demo. It's on Halloween at 5 p.m. Central. And I've set it up to allow registrations. And I don't have any attendees or registrants at the moment. So if I go back over here, and I'm going to use my own information again, bhunt@smoothfusion.com, and submit. Now what that's going to do is it's going to register me as a registrant for this event. So if I reload this screen, you should now see I am a registrant for this event, and I can view the registrants and see. And what's even better is that behind the scenes, Zoom will then send me as a registrant the link and the information that I need to join the meeting. And so that email just came in, so I'll show you what that looks like. So just a standard Zoom email that has the information for the event. I didn't have to do anything else other than connect up with a Zap, and it sent the information to the person that signed up. So that's pretty handy. And let's look at how that works in Zapier. So it's very similar to the others. So this is create a Zoom meeting registrant. So catch the hook, only continue if the form name matches the form that I wanted, run the JavaScript, and here's the only step for that one. So I have chosen the Zoom app, and I chose to create a meeting registrant. You could also create a webinar registrant or create a meeting, just depending on what you're trying to automate. Again, I've got the account configured ahead of time, and then I can choose. And when you click on this upcoming meeting, what it does is it queries, and you can see there's a whole bunch of meetings already set up in our account, but I had chosen the Halloween demo. And I'd mapped the email, the first name, the last name. This one's pretty straightforward. And then the confirmation shows whether or not a person's going to receive a confirmation email when signing up, and you could see that I did. So another example of easy integration with a common tool that probably a lot of us are using for our business these days. Next thing I want to show you is a JIRA integration. So at Smooth Fusion, we use JIRA for bug tracking, issue tracking, project management, project oversight, and so on. And so I've created a project here in JIRA, and I've created one for Progress Accelerated at Next, and it currently doesn't have any issues. And so I'll go back to my Sitefinity form and pretend that I am a customer logging an issue, so I'll just log it as myself. And I'm going to give this issue a priority because in our JIRA setup we have priorities on each of the issues. So let's say this is a high priority issue, and maybe the issue title is something like cannot log in to the site. Please help me, I cannot log into my website, and submit. And then we should be able to go over to JIRA and momentarily see that issue show up. There it is. So here's the issue, cannot log into the site. I've provided the title, I provided a description, and this one got assigned to the, showed me as a default reporter because that's how I set up the step in Zapier. So let's take a look at how that works in Zapier. There's one little trick on this one. So add new JIRA issue is the one I want to look at. So same basic steps, catch the raw hook, only continue if it matches the filter, run the JavaScript. So here's the new thing that I had to do on this one. Whenever you're submitting the issue to JIRA, that issue has to have a status. So in this case, it has priority high, which is what I selected on the form. There are other statuses or priorities that we have in our system. And the issue is that you can't map from the form fields that we had on our form. I can't just directly pass in low, medium, high, or highest, because under the covers, JIRA has those stored as IDs. And so what I did here is I used a utility that's also from Zapier, and I used what's called a lookup table. And very straightforward, as you can see here, I pulled in the value of the priority from the previous step. And then what I did is I used a lookup table so that if the user put highest as the selection on the form dropdown, it maps that to a 1 value that JIRA uses to actually set the priority. So that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, how you might use lookups for various things. I could have used a lookup also, for example, if I wanted to submit this to a different JIRA project based on the customer's email address or something like that, I might use a lookup to map their email to the project or something. So now that I've got those values, then when you get to the next step to create the issue inside of JIRA, then I set the project. I manually set that here in my Zap. I manually set it to a type bug. You could have done another lookup table to determine a type if you wanted. And then I passed in the title for the summary, the description, and then here, notice this is coming from step 4. So this shows me that it pulled in the value 1, which was the lookup value, not the value that was selected from the form, and I got that from step 4 because that was the output from the step above. So that's just an example of how you could even further format the data before it gets sent over to whatever system you're using. And Zapier has a number of those different formatting tools. You can extract data, you can run regular expressions, you can do lots of stuff. So it just takes a little bit of experimentation. So that's an example of integration with JIRA. And we've got 2 left you can see. So the next one is going to be an integration with DocuSign. So we use DocuSign at Smooth Fusion to sign documents, and one of the things that we always sign when we start working with somebody is a master services agreement. And the master services agreement just is the sort of boilerplate language that establishes the relationship between our two companies. So that form doesn't change from customer to customer. The only thing it changes is the signature blocks for each customer. So in this example, what I've done is I've set up a template inside of DocuSign ahead of time, and I've just mapped those form fields. So in this case, this is going to be our customer filling this out, and I guess we'll just fill it out as me again. And once I complete this, it's going to go to DocuSign. It's going to find the template that I've created ahead of time, and it's going to create a new envelope and send that to the person that filled out this form. So I should be able to go to my email, and now I've just received real-time this message that says, Brad Hunt, please DocuSign this master services agreement. And I can go and review that as the signer, and I can start the process. Now, I'm already in the DocuSign system, and so it recognizes some of these fields, but in my case, the customer could populate the name, they could populate their address, and what I did in this case is I just pre-signed the right-hand side, and I used the same placeholder value so that when the customer signs it here, then they would adopt and sign, and finish. Oh, I need an address. And we'll finish. And once that's submitted, then it'll send the person that completed the form the completed copy of the fully executed document. So I thought that was kind of a cool way to automate a process that is a little bit cumbersome and manual. So I just received this fully executed PDF that's signed by me twice, basically. So again, a nice way to automate that step of something that might have been a manual process in the past. So the last example that I want to show you in this demonstration is a little bit more advanced, but it builds on the ideas that we've been using so far. So in this form, I wanted to capture what our customers thought about our work. And so if this was like a customer satisfaction survey, what we want to do is collect their information. And we might have other form fields in a real scenario, but in this case, I'm just collecting first name, last name, email, and some comments. And so what I want to do here is I want to look at their comments, and I want to figure out is what they're saying more negative, more positive, and if it's a negative, something negative, I want to be able to take action on that right away. I don't want to let that sort of fester. And so, for example, if I say, again, I'll use my own information, and let's say this was maybe for a hotel review or something. I could say something like, you know, the hotel really had a bad smell. The sheets were wet. The food was terrible. The floor was not clean. I had a bad experience. I'm intentionally using a lot of negative words here. I hate this place. And so when I submit this, it's actually in the background running a Microsoft Cognitive Services API and passing that message over to the API to determine if the sentiment for that message was positive or negative. And so what it's going to do is if it experiences or if it determines that that review content is negative, it's going to send me an email and warn me that I have a negative review. So what I'm going to do is let's look over here in Zapier and see how that one works. And I'm going to go to sentiment detection. And what happens is I catch the raw hook just like before. I only continue if the form name matches the form that's submitted. And then I run the JavaScript to extract the variables. And now this is something different. So I'm going to do this custom request. And what I'm telling it is I want this step to do a request of some other API. And so here's where I coordinate that information or input that information. So I'm telling Zapier to do a post over to a URL. Now what I did ahead of time is I went and I set this up inside of Azure. I created a new Cognitive Services account for the text analytics and the sentiment detection. And it gave me a URL based on the service that I set up. And then I looked at the documentation for the analytics API, and it gave me the format for the JSON. And so I've got, this is the format that's provided. It's got a language attribute, you give it an ID, and then you just pass in the text. So just like before, I pulled in a value from a prior step, and this is one from a previous step I did earlier when I was testing. And that gets passed over to that API. And for this API to work, you have to tell it what the content type is, and you have to pass it a subscription key. So this is the key that I got out of the Azure portal, and so it's going to add those as headers. And it's going to send that data over to Azure API, and then I've got another filter step. And what happens out of that experience is you basically get a score. So the score comes back between 0 and 1, and the closer to 1 that score is, the more positive the sentiment. And the closer to 0 it is, the more negative the sentiment. And so what I'm doing in my case is I only want to get an email if that score is less than 0.5. So if it's a positive review, I'm okay with not knowing about it right away. But if it's a negative review, I do want to know so that I can take action. And if it is a negative review, then it's going to send an outbound email, and it's going to send that to me, and I've just added in there the outbound email, what the value from the fields are, and then the comments. And this is what the email looks like that I received. So it said, Brad Hunt, the hotel, really bad smell, sheets were wet, food was terrible. And so you can see I got an immediate feedback from my form submission that something was wrong with my hotel stay. So I thought that was a pretty cool example of an advanced integration that you can do. And again, as long as you build from those basic building blocks, you can do some more advanced things like this. So I hope that this presentation has given you some tips and some advice on how to get started by connecting Sitefinity to an external system using an automation tool like Zapier. I hope this kind of got your juices flowing and you could start brainstorming ideas of how you could use this in your own environment. And I hope the time was useful. So thanks very much for attending Progress Accelerated Next, and thanks for attending the session. I'll be around in the chat. If you have additional questions, feel free to stick around and ask. Have a great day.